Diabetes and insulin resistance is a growing problem here in the US and globally. Rates were on the rise for many, many years, but then the mandated restrictions of the pandemic era in the last few years have really exploded the numbers in terms of the prevalence of diabetes and insulin resistance, as well as the severity of the disease. So most people aren't even really aware that they have insulin resistance, if they have it, or diabetes. And when they get tested, they're getting tests that are sort of like late markers, and you would probably want to know earlier. So there's much better tests to look at to have sort of early markers of this condition. So the spirit of this video is to talk about what is insulin resistance and diabetes, and then to look at certain blood tests that certainly detect the problem much earlier. So let's get to it. So as I was saying, the rates of diabetes are skyrocketing since the pandemic. So for example, let's take a look at this paper that found despite no significant change in the number of pediatric type 2 diabetes or severity of presentation over the 2 years before the pandemic, we found a 182% increase in pediatric type 2 diabetes with a steady rate of monthly increase during the first 12 months of the COVID-19 pandemic. This increase in cases was accompanied by a nearly 6-fold rise in diabetic ketoacidosis. So what I want to do is talk about how to properly test for diabetes and insulin resistance that goes beyond just your fasting blood sugar or hemoglobin A1C, which tend to be late markers. But before we do that, we really kind of need to look at what insulin resistance is, how it's supposed to work, and what goes wrong. So when you eat something, primarily carbohydrates, your blood sugar will go up. And it doesn't necessarily have to just be eating something. So there's other things that can make your blood sugar go up besides just eating a lot of carbs. But that's for another day. So anyways, your blood sugar goes up, and we're going to represent that here with this little yellow sphere with a big G on it. And what you need to do is get that blood sugar out of the blood vessel and into the cell where it can be used for fuel. But unfortunately, glucose has a hard time getting into cells. It's capable, but it's not really very good at it. And so you need the pancreas to help it along. So on comes the pancreas, and it has sensors that detect high blood sugar. So when it does that, it secretes this hormone called insulin. And insulin will bind to an insulin receptor on the outside of the cell. And when it does so, it opens up a channel in the cell membrane, which allows glucose to go into the cell where it can be used for fuel. And that's how things are supposed to work, but as we know, things can certainly go wrong. And so in the case of insulin resistance, there's often an excess amount of glucose, which is going to make the pancreas create an excess amount of insulin. And over time, the insulin receptors sort of become sick and tired of this so much insulin, so they become resistant to insulin. Sort of like an old married couple that are sick and tired of each other nagging, so they get like selective hearing. Anyways, so insulin receptors are now a bit resistant to insulin, and the pancreas now has to secrete more insulin. And as it does more insulin, the insulin receptors become more and more resistant. And despite the receptors becoming more resistant, the insulin can still do the job of getting the glucose into the cell. It just requires a lot more insulin to do so. So over time, more and more insulin causes more and more insulin receptor resistance. And ultimately, you're at a point where it just doesn't really work anymore, and the glucose can't really get into the cells. And at that point, when glucose can't get into the cells, you start to see rising blood sugar levels. So basically, insulin resistance means not full out diabetes, where you have really, really high blood sugar. It's just slightly elevated blood sugar, and you're requiring a lot of insulin to get the glucose into the cells. So for example, if we take a look at these two people where fasting blood sugar is relatively the same, you might say person B has better blood sugar control because their fasting blood sugar is just a little bit lower than person A. However, if we were to test their fasting insulin, we'd see that person B is requiring a lot more insulin in order to get their blood sugar down to a normal range. Because they are requiring so much insulin, we would say that that person is insulin resistant. Now, unfortunately, when most people get their blood work tested for diabetes, they're looking at fasting blood sugar and they're looking at hemoglobin A1C. And what hemoglobin A1C is, it's the name of it tells you what it is. Hemoglobin is on the red blood cells, and that's circulating around through your blood. And hemoglobin is partly a protein. And when a protein encounters sugar in the bloodstream, it often binds together. So then now glucose is bound to the hemoglobin on the red blood cell. So your average red blood cell lives about 120 days. So hemoglobin A1C is testing how much glucose is bound to the red blood cell on the hemoglobin. And so it's sort of like an average measurement of your blood sugar levels over the past 3 months, right? But in order for that to go up, you have to have elevated blood sugar levels, right? And elevated blood sugar levels happen way after you started to develop insulin resistance. I hope that makes sense. So testing the fasting blood sugar at the same time you test how much insulin it takes to get that blood sugar down is a much earlier marker and better marker than testing something like fasting blood sugar or hemoglobin A1C, which tend to be later markers. And there's a lot of other confounding factors that go along with hemoglobin A1C other than just that. So after we know what your fasting insulin level is, at the exact same time of your fasting blood sugar level, we can take those two values and plug it into something called the HOMA-IR, which gives us a much more reliable calculation of your insulin resistance compared to hemoglobin A1C. Another similar test is the Quickie index. But if we take those two values that we had from those two people and we just plug those numbers into this calculation, the HOMA-IR calculation essentially says that if the number is above 2, you might be insulin resistant, and if it's below 2, then you're probably not insulin resistant. The higher the number, obviously, not good news. It's not just all of a sudden if you're over 2, you're bad, and if you're under 2, you're good. There's shades of gray of this whole thing. So if we plug these numbers in, you can see patient A, remember, had a fasting blood sugar of 98, and their fasting insulin level was 6. So that means their HOMA-IR score is 1.45, which is well below the 2, right? And then person B had a little bit lower fasting blood sugar of 96, but their insulin was pretty high at 15. And now that HOMA-IR calculation comes out to 3.56, which is significantly above that level of 2. So that person has insulin resistance. So there's other markers we can look at, like C-peptide. It's also made by the pancreas, and it's sort of in parallel with what insulin does, but C-peptide is a little bit longer lasting, a little bit more stable. We can look at things like triglycerides, but my point is, if we're just looking at fasting blood sugar and hemoglobin A1C, those are relatively late markers of what's going on, because by the time that they're elevated, your blood sugar is up and the insulin resistance has happened already. I hope that makes sense. So the higher the insulin levels, obviously the more insulin resistance there is, right? So the consequences of diabetes and insulin resistance can't be understated, right? You get diabetic nephropathy, where your kidneys start to fail, right? You get chronic kidney disease. You get diabetic neuropathy, where you get tingling in the hands and feet. You get diabetic retinopathy, where your vision starts to go. You can get something called type 3 diabetes. People have heard of type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. Type 3 diabetes is the colloquial term for dementia, because high blood sugar levels have big consequences for the brain, and it's a big predisposing factor for Alzheimer's and dementia. And then cardiovascular disease, right? It's probably the biggest contributor to cardiovascular disease to have insulin resistance and diabetes. But aside from those like more severe things, just quality of life issues are really hampered when you have diabetes and insulin resistance. There's weight gain, there's brain fog, there's fatigue, there's sleep disorders, there's poor healing in wounds, all sorts of different things that affect your quality of life, right? So don't get caught off guard by this. Catch it early, get the right blood tests. Go back and look at your previous blood work and insulin wasn't tested, maybe ask for it next time, or come to our office and we can do a thorough evaluation for diabetes. But don't get caught off guard by this, all right? It's so important. The rates are really, really rising, and your health is always in your hands, right? So take care of it. All right, take care, bye.